my mom, we would go down to South Mississippi, and she had a lady that she would do summer camps with, and while my mom was teaching all the other kids about barrel racing, this lady would give me English writing lessons. And so I never actually showed in competition English, but a lot of my writing skills were developed from taking those English writing lessons. And so in English, you know, they utilize that sternum because it's a point of a transition for the horses where if you can get a horse to lift through the sternum, then what you get is a transfer of weight from the front end to the back end. And where you see this is when you see a horse coming up to set up for a jump. Right before they jump, they're going to lift through that sternum to be able to get the weight to the back end so that they can get that front end off the ground. So if I got my mom to come out here for just a second, this is just a little thing that she does at her clinics, and I wanted to show you right quick. If I ask her to stand on one foot, okay, what can she do with that foot that's now off the ground? She can go forward, she can go backward, she can go sideways, she can go across her body. But what can she do with the foot that's on the ground? If I ask her to move the foot that's on the ground, she's going to have to transfer her weight from one foot to the other to be able to move the foot that's on the ground. So that's what you call a transition. She transitions her weight from one foot now to the other foot. So she can't move the foot that's on the ground because it's got weight on it. And so if you ride these colts and you're just constantly pulling them down in the bridle and pulling them down in the bridle, you can get them riding really heavy on that forearm, and it limits their ability to then lift that up and engage behind. And so I spend quite a bit of time with my colts, even with Bayek, even though he's a little bit naturally up right there, he still has to kind of learn that control of that sternum to be able to make that transfer of that weight to the back end. And so I'll show you on Bayek how I do that. So with Bayek, as I'm coming across here, you can see he's kind of wanting to be up right here. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of sit on him and kind of bump his face with my hands and with both legs. And I want him, before I let him turn that barrel, I want to feel him come down into this bridle and gather up and be collected. One of the things that happens is when he lifts his head on me out in front of those barrels, is I lose control over his shoulders and these withers, and that's when you'll see those horses, they'll start to brace right there and really push into that barrel, and it's because you haven't worked on getting those horses where they'll gather up in the bridle and get that transfer of weight to the back end and keep this front part of their shoulders and wither supple right here. And so the way that I do that is, if you could imagine if I had a string that ran basically from my saddle horn and dissected him through his withers and came out of the point of his chest, and I'm going to pull back on that string right there, how would that feel? Because that's where you're asking for that lift to start, is right in that area. Now, I don't necessarily want to just lift his head up in the air, because then I'm actually getting a little bit of the opposite effect. If I just ask him to lift his head and I'm not also asking for that break at the pole right there, I'm going to get the opposite, where he can lift his head, but he's going to drop out in that sternum and build that underneath part of his neck, and that's where I'm going to start to lose control, and later that's going to become a hole. And so this is something that you start off with these 2-year-olds, and you work on it with just one barrel until they get to the place that they can give you the response that you need, because you don't want to start them off with a wrong idea right here. So you can just work this as one barrel. You just come up here, kind of melt in your saddle, ask for that softness in that collection. I use my inside foot to keep movement in the rib cage. One of the things that I trigger in my mind when I'm training is I think hip to the barrel. I always want the hip to move to the barrel before the front end moves to the barrel. So another thing that I'll do is when I approach the barrel, you can ask them to stop. Use your outside foot, kind of push that hip to the barrel. Lift on that inside rein. The reason that I think that is because I always want to give these colts a place for those shoulders to move to. I never want to have their shoulders so tight on the barrel that their only option is to move their hip around. I always want to have them where their hip is on the barrel and they move their shoulders around. And that helps keep that forward motion, because this is where the power comes from. The power comes from back here. So I always want to keep that part engaged and the weight shifted to back here, to the back part of the horse, and not pulling them down on their front end or crowding their shoulders right here, so that their only thing that they can do is to swing their hip. I always want to keep the shoulders opened up and in front of the barrel. So if I'm circling this barrel, I want the barrel to stay behind my leg so that his shoulders always have that room to move in to that turn right there.